Just be blessed.
My life began very different and very troubling. I grew up, my parents had a store, and I grew up in the store, and I was allowed to eat whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted, as long as I didn't waste anything, as long as I finished what I took. Well, I developed quite a taste for sugar, I'll have you know, and of course, my father being a butcher by trade, I had a pretty good appetite for steaks. We had the best steaks, you know, obviously. And so that's how I started out growing up with my diet. Diet plays a big part in my life, as I will find out. I was about 6 years old and my father was murdered. It was December 23rd, 1963. And it's funny because the Christmas pictures of that year, they were underexposed and they were all dark, dark pictures. And it was a very sad time, and I was very close to my dad. I was a daddy's boy for sure. And so I grew up without a father. And my mother felt so, you know, my mother sold everything my father had, paid the bills, and we had enough to buy a little house, a very old house down on the river. As time went on, my mother had 2 children from a black man. And keeping in mind, this is the 1960s when there's race riots going on in Cincinnati, Ohio. And we live kind of out in the country a little bit and in a white community. Having half black sisters during this time period gave me a unique perspective on prejudice. And so we'd go to the store and I'd see people look at my mom and look at my sister and then look back at my mom. And by the time they looked at me, I was filled with hatred from the look on their face of disgust and you know, even my mother's own family rejected her because of having a relationship with a black man and having two half black children. And I loved my sisters, and we grew up really close. Now, when we moved to this house on the river, we happened to move into a very wealthy school district. And in the school district were, I could name some names that you would recognize that I went to school with. And we were very poor. And so, needless to say, I was rejected by my father's death. Not having a father, I felt rejection. I felt hatred and bitterness towards the world, for they had taken my father. My mother didn't let me go to the funeral, so sometimes I had thoughts in my mind that maybe he really wasn't dead. And thoughts of rejection from the community because of prejudice against my mother and my sisters. I felt rejection from school because my first girlfriend told me that, William, I like you, but you're poor. And I said, Kim, I'm not poor. Her name was Kim, and she says, well, William, look at your clothes. You know, my mom always worked hard, and we had nice clothes to go to school in, but they weren't Izod, Lacoste, or designer clothes. So I felt rejection from school, never fit in. All the years, the elementary school, junior high school, and then in high school, I just always was rejected, and needless to say, I dropped out. You know, my mother was always kind of a loner. She didn't have any friends. She would go to work. She would work hard. You know, like I said, we always had nice clothes. But, you know, I experienced so much rejection. Rejection from the society, rejection from school, rejection from family. Even my own father's family didn't believe I was a Garten because my father had a vasectomy before I was born. And so they really never believed that I was a Garten until much later on in my life. I had a girlfriend in Cincinnati, and I really fell in love with her, and her mother was really unique, and I got along with the family real well. And So they moved to Santa Monica, California, and about 2 months later, maybe almost 3 months later, and here I'm 17 years old, my mom puts me on a Greyhound bus across the country from Cincinnati to Santa Monica, California, and I go to stay with Maggie. And they moved to Santa Monica because of the Prosperos Center, which was right there on 4th Street in Santa Monica. The study of the mind, it was metaphysics. I had never been to church my entire life. My mother was a Seventh-day Adventist years ago and had some of the books, but she was definitely not a churchgoer when I was born and when I grew up, and neither was my father. And so this is kind of like church, I guess. For a while it was, and I was attending some of the classes and listening to Mrs. Leonard and all the lectures and things that she went through. She would share with us. And Maggie was pretty interested. Even her little brother was a member. And so here I'm living on 10th Street in Santa Monica with Mrs. Leonard, my girlfriend, sharing a room with my girlfriend and with her little brother who had his own room. And I'm working a little bit. You know, I go to work for, this guy gets me a job who was part of the Prosperos. So here I'm delivering furniture for McMahon's Furniture in Santa Monica. And I'm learning these things about the study of the mind. I even remember the mantra, you know, truth is that which is so. That which is not truth is not so. Therefore, truth is all there is. Truth is all, whole, complete, perfect, infinite mind unfolding. And so I noticed that everything was inward. They were trying to get at at self. Well, they would teach that people have a lot of sexual hang-ups. So a lot of the exercises were based around, you know, the sexual norms and the abnorms and the strange. And I can remember the more I was involved in it, the more I experienced it, the words kept coming to my mind. This is satanic. And even though I'd never been to church in my life, I did have somewhat of an understanding. I didn't read my Bible, but when I was a kid, I held very reverently this Bible book that had a lot of pictures. I couldn't read then, but I remember I used to mark the page with a Kleenex, and brand new Kleenex, at white, pure, and it was always very important to me, always very spiritual. And so when I was experiencing these things at the Prosperos, they seemed very satanic. That's the only word I can use to describe them. I start meeting a lot of friends because there's kids in the building, there's kids that Maggie goes to school with, and I'm a little bit older than her friends, and so the friends I'm making are a couple of years younger, so I have a little bit of you know, the elder brother kind of treatment. They have a little respect for me, and plus the fact that I'm, you know, moved out there and stepped out on my own in life, and I was just barely 18, you know, made some friends, and some surfer friends, and so I'm hanging out with the surfer friends. I bought myself a surfer van, and we're smoking pot. I got long hair, doing the young people thing, cruising to the beach, you know, and just being mellow. We weren't getting in trouble or anything like that, but anyway, I started to work. I had to pay for my van. I had to pay Mrs. Leonard to live there. And so I started taking on a little responsibility. Well, I started working for Theta Cable Television. Cable television was brand new in Southern California, and there was very limited areas that we could call on to sell. And so the building I lived in was a 23-unit building, and we couldn't put cable in any other building smaller than that. So if a 23 unit building or more, we could put the cable in. And so I sold cable to more than half of the people in our building, and so we got cable television. And that made me popular with some of the neighbors, so I started to have more friends. And I wasn't being rejected anymore. I was welcomed and I was comfortable. And I was starting to grow up a little bit. I started feeling a little bit of confidence, which I'd never had before. Well, here I pull my hair back in a ponytail. I go to the thrift store and buy my first blazer and my first necktie. And I'm knocking on doors from 5:30 to 8:30 in the evening selling cable television. And I'm making pretty good money. I make $18.40 every time I sell the Z channel and the basic service. And I make $8.95 every time I sell the basic service. Well, needless to say, I sold more 1840s. So I knock on the door of this man one day, and this old guy, gray hair, and he's probably in his early 60s. And he invites me in, and he's just real friendly, and he starts showing me this light show and that he invented. And I just marvel at how smart this guy is. He's a former college professor. He holds 2 U.S. patents to his credit. And he's just one of the most smartest people I ever met. And needless to say, we became fast friends. And every time I needed to know something, I would call Bob Smith. It was Robert Marion Smith was his name, I'll never forget. We stayed in contact for years and years after that. But he was trim, and he had a lot of energy, and his secret was, he told me, he says he drinks his dynamite cocktail, which was a combination of all sorts of things, but I remember it had brewer's yeast in it, their nutritional yeast, and some other vitamins and supplements that he was taking. He belonged to the Santa Monica Food Co-op, which was a brand new thing. So needless to say, I became a member of the Santa Monica Food Co-op, eating health foods. Because up until this point, my idea of a good meal was a Snicker bars and a 6.5 ounce Coke, because I had developed a taste for sugar early in life, and I suffered for it. I mean, I would catch a cold, and then I'd get the flu, strep throat. They would all happen in a row after row, and I'd be sick for weeks. So I started eating healthier. I started being more health conscious. At least from the world's perspective, I was. And so I was a hippie still, and still smoked pot, but I was eating healthy. Well, as time went on, probably in my early 20s, I'm working for National Automobile Club. I'm a district sales manager for National Automobile Club. And I meet my wife, the mother of my children. Believe it or not, at a discotheque in Westwood Village called Dylan's. And I met her and her best friend, and we're sitting at a table having drinks. I asked Cheryl if I can have a dance, and she said no. And so I asked Kim, the mother of my children, and so she agreed, and we got up and danced, and needless to say, we ended up being married from there. Well, I find myself living in Burbank, California. My wife and I were very happy. We began to plan a family. And we also think about buying a house. But with 13.5% interest rates and living in Los Angeles in a housing bubble, we decided to think about moving out of state before we had kids. We didn't want to raise up our kids in the city. And so we were thinking about Grants Pass, where her parents were, or back to Cincinnati, where my mom was. And so we ended up moving to Cincinnati. And an interesting thing happened to Kim at her work. There was a Christian man, born-again Christian, that she worked with. And he was, I only met him once briefly, but he had a tremendous impact on her, because my wife would tell me, she says, you know, I want what he has. And so my wife, having beginnings of spiritual interests. And now that I'm back in Cincinnati, I'm working at a furniture store. I'm working on the weekends, so I don't go to church, you know. And so she started to go to church because she had the weekends off. And she started to feel welcome at church. And when she had spiritual questions, well, my mother was a real bookworm. And so my mother would answer her questions quite at length. And so here we are. Suddenly we're finding ourselves attending church on a regular basis. I'm working at a furniture store. It was an Ethan Allen store in Cincinnati. My wife's got a pretty good job and we're attending church. I found this book. Because I'm working at a furniture store, I had a lot of time to read. And so I was always kind of a slow reader, but I started reading this book, Counsels on Diets and Foods, by Ellen G. White, a prolific writer from the 1800s. And I discovered that this woman had health principles that I thought that I was just learning about multigrains. She wrote about multigrains in the 1800s, and that was a new discovery in the 70s. And it really struck me. And she was a very godly woman and spoke a lot about Christ and about the importance of the home and the family. And here my wife's pregnant and we're just about to start a family. We're living in our first home that we own. And so I'm reading this book with amazement. And here I thought that, oh boy, I was reading Dirk Pearson's and Sandy Shaw's book on life extension, and on top of my refrigerator was every vitamin known to man, and I was taking them not really very intelligently, but I would just take them as I felt that I needed them. And and eating veggies. We were pretty much a vegetarian diet. We ate a lot of cheese and eggs, but we're pretty much laying off the meat, and because of all the disease found and transferred to the human body in meat. And I'm discovering some Bible principles about health and nutrition. And one of my favorite Bible texts is, whether you eat or whether you drink or whatsoever you do all to the glory of God. And we don't want to defile our bodies because they're the temple of the Holy Spirit. And so I'm getting more and more involved. I read the book Sugar Blues. And for years after I read that book, Sugar Blues, I didn't touch a thing with sugar in it. I mean, I would eat honey or maple syrup, and, but I'm feeling better. I got more energy, and life is starting to be good. I'm now a new father. My wife is baptized. We're both baptized together, and she's baptized while still pregnant with my daughter, and I always thought that was kind of special. But now we've got a child and we're reading Bible stories to her. Somebody came to our door and sold us the My Bible Friends and some other Bible books. And so we're becoming Christians, and we're experiencing a happy life right at this point. I mentioned that I grew up without a dad. I grew up without any male influence at all. And when I tried to pattern my life after Jesus, it was difficult. I didn't have an idea what it was like to be a man, to be a father, to be a good husband. And as time went on, my marriage ended in divorce. My children were still fairly young, 9 and 10. And we had moved back to California. We're living in Central California now. And I still was maintaining my diet pretty much, but I was starting to backslide. I started drinking a little alcohol, and I couldn't find any pot because it was hard for me to make friends always in my life. And so I can remember just trying to find some pot, and I couldn't do it. I had a businessman's haircut, and I always looked like a narc, I guess, because I always had trouble finding it. But I started driving a truck back during that time period. And I went down to Los Angeles and went to truck driving school and learned to drive an 18-wheeler. And here I am one night, and keep in mind, I still had a pretty good diet. I wasn't using caffeine. You know, I was eating pretty much a vegetarian diet. And here I'm driving a truck late at night. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm coming through. I left Los Angeles. I'm driving through Ventura. It opens up to 5 lanes there, and I'm in the truck lane, and there's no traffic. I fall asleep. And when I wake up is just as I'm entering into the fast lane and approaching the center median wall. Wow. Needless to say, I stopped the truck. I got some caffeine. Yeah, and then I started drinking caffeine. I started drinking more alcohol because I'd be so hopped up on caffeine when I'd get home at 6 o'clock in the morning or 6:30. I'd start drinking some beer so I could go to sleep. Well, then I was seeing a doctor because I was sick all the time, and I was taking Valium and drinking alcohol to get to sleep and to just keep from losing my temper. Well, during this time is the time that you know, my wife left, shortly after this anyway. And but it was the starting of a downhill spiral. I backslid. I stopped going to church. I played church for a while because I was a teacher in the primary. But as I went downhill, you know, I started stepping back from things. We moved again. We moved up to Oregon this time, and that's about the time when my wife finally left. It was a surprise that she left. I really didn't know at the time. I didn't know that she just had enough of my anger and had enough of me being drunk or smoking pot or taking pills or whatever I was doing. And then I got in a little trouble. I got into some legal trouble. And I can remember one day she just came home and she said, you know, William, I'm going to the hospital to have a hysterectomy, and I want a divorce. And that was it. We didn't try to work on the marriage. We didn't try to, you know, we didn't go to counseling. It was just all of a sudden, you know, my wife is gone. And it was really traumatic and really devastating. It was May 19th, and coincidentally in history, there's a dark day, May 19th. I think it's 1833, something like that. But May 19th, and that was the very day that my wife left, and I didn't see her again for months after that. Got the divorce papers in the mail, and it was a pretty sad and low time. And then I just kind of went downhill from there. Well, it was during this time that I started realizing depression. I was deep sadness. I was very close to my kids. I was always home with them whenever I could be, and other than work. But you know, it was sad. But and I realized that at that point I was experiencing depression, and I didn't want to hang around people, and I just stayed at the house a lot, and I was just sad. Well, I did start to go back to church a little bit then during that period, and tried to get my act together. But again, I was trying to do it on my own. I wasn't trusting in the Lord. I was just depending on myself. And you know, I was trying to win my wife back, but it just seems like anything I did, it didn't matter. And then I got those final divorce papers in the mail, and that was it. You know, I knew that if we got a divorce, that it would be the end. And so I went off with serious depression during this time. Many years go by of depression and just wasted years. More trouble. Just a lot of wasted years. I moved to Medford from Grants Pass, And I started getting serious about life. I started going back to church. I was working a little bit, kind of part-time, and I had a lot of time to study. And I was studying God's Word, and the Lord started to lead me. And so I'm going back to church. It's a nice church, you know. People were friendly to a degree, but they left me alone, and that was important for me at that time. And started going to the church school, you know, to the Sabbath school is what they call it. And I met a girl while I was in Sabbath school, and her name was Susan. And one day it was raining, and here I'm walking back to the place I lived, and it was April 14th. It was Pear Blossom Festival time. And she offered me a ride. And I had recognized her from church and from Sabbath school, and so here she's taking me home. And we got kind of stuck in the traffic in the parade, and we just pulled over. I says, you can just pull over here and park, and I'll get out and walk the rest of the way. It's easier than driving around all the traffic. And so I just kept talking, and we kept talking, and we kept conversating, and before I knew it, 20 minutes went by, half hour went by, and she invited me to her home for lunch. So I turned around and went home. I got to meet her oldest son. He was there at the house, and she started making lunch, and he was a former drug addict, gone through the NA program. He was about 5 years clean at that time, and him and I had some things in common, so we hit it off right away. And as it was that Susan and I hit it off pretty good too. And by 11 o'clock that night, I ended up going home. We spent the whole afternoon walking and talking, and it was just very pleasant. And so I did meet my future bride. Well, so it wasn't very long, and my wife and I were married. Susan and I were married, and we started making a home together. It was our second marriage for both of us. And she was married to a pediatrician, and she's an educated woman, and in fact, she's a physical therapist and has been for 30-some years. And being uneducated and kind of a man of the world, and back and forth with my Christian experience, that really wore on me. That I would just, and her being as smart as she is, very high IQ, very intelligent, very good with her patients. She's pretty good at everything she does, and it's interesting that we really have a lot in common, believe it or not. We think alike, we're very much the same type of person, but very different in our upbringing. So we both kind of learn from each other. And having two men, her sons, that are both in recovery, one now 14 years and the other 13 years in recovery, she had a lot of savvy about what was going on with me. And so when I would slip into depression or bouts of anger, once she learned how to handle me, and I don't know how else to say it, but she could handle me pretty well. Most people would get scared, but Susan's pretty tough. And then I started to become more aware of being depressed and where was my anger coming from. And every time I would have a disappointment or a struggle or a hard time or lose a job or have trouble at work, disappointment, I would go back to that drinking wine or caffeine. Caffeine was my drug of choice, I'm sorry to say. And I would drink 10 or 12 cups of coffee a day, trips to Dutch Brothers, 5 shots. a $5 cup of coffee, and I'd have that several times a day. Or the big 24-ounce Red Bulls, I'd have 5 or 6 of those a day. And just to maintain. And it didn't help with my anger. It did not help with my depression. And even though I was maintaining a pretty good diet, I was still suffering in a big way.